Osborne's sums don't add up, and he's not got the money to pay for these promises. So Labour will make sure in future this can't happen again. We will legislate not only to allow the independent OBR to independently audit the manifesto spending and tax commitments of parties which choose that audit. We will legislate to require the OBR to do it for all the main parties. And today I call on all the other main political parties to say whether they will support vital legislation after the election to make sure this can happen. But George Osborne's failure to let the OBR scrutinise our manifesto in this Parliament doesn't mean he should be able now to escape scrutiny of his plans. For the next 3 weeks, we and the British people will challenge him and the Conservative Party every day to say, how will you pay for your promises? Where will the money come from? And who will end up paying the price for these uncosted and unfunded promises? And we will say to him, how can anyone trust you to deliver these promises when you can't tell people where the money's coming from? Day after day, over the last few days, Conservative ministers have been on television and they've been unable to answer these questions. On Sunday, George Osborne was asked 18 times how he could pay for his commitment on the National Health Service. 18 times, George Osborne refused to answer the question because he doesn't know where the money's coming from. The Tories are trying to take people for fools. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. They won't be allowed to get away with it, and we will make sure they can never try to pull this trick again in future. So at the end of this manifesto week, the choice is now clearer than ever. It's a choice between Labour's better plan for working people or a Tory approach for the few, not the many. It's a choice between Labour's concrete, fully funded pledges, which don't require any additional borrowing, and Conservative plans, panicky promises, desperate and unbelievable promises which the Tories can't tell people how they'll pay for. Desperate and unbelievable Tory promises which we all know will end up with working people paying the price, £1,400 a year for every working person in the United Kingdom. That is why we need a Labour government, because our National Health Service and working people in Britain can't afford 5 more years of the Tories. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, right, we should take some questions, and I'll try and make sure that we take them for a broad range of people, including the expert question askers. I'll start with Carl, though, because he's an expert. Carl from ITV.
ITV News, thank you. 2 questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, in this audit, you say this will cost working families £1,439. The Institute for Fiscal Studies criticised the Conservative Party when they used that measure, that working families measure, to accuse you of raising taxes by £3,000. Aren't you doing exactly the same thing? And on a separate issue altogether, if you don't mind, I understand Lord Janner has been suspended from the Labour Party, and I was wondering if I could get your reaction to that and the decision by the CPS not to prosecute him.
Well, on the latter question, first of all, these are very serious allegations. I understand the CPS decision, but the Labour Party has acted swiftly and decisively today to make that suspension. And I think it's the right thing to do. I'm not going to say anything more about that. On the your former point, the £3,000 from the Conservative Party was completely destroyed by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Every assumption upon which that was based was not correct. I thought it was comprehensively undermined. There is nothing in our manifesto which is not costed and paid for. It requires no additional borrowing, and we are proposing some tax changes for those with the highest earnings, for example, the mansion tax, or putting the top rate of income tax up. But we've been very clear in our tax commitments to working people. The contrast between that and the Conservative position is profoundly different. They have a whole series of unfunded commitments. They don't even deny the unfunded commitments. They're not even pretending to say where the money will come from. They just sort of think that somehow we're going to ignore this big gaping hole, £25 billion of unfunded promises on top of a plan which already means deeper spending cuts in the next 3 years than in the last 5. What we've done in detail is we've costed each one of these proposals in a cautious way. We've added them up and said, for working people, what would this mean on average? £25 billion a year works out at slightly over £1,400 a year per household. Now, of course, it's going to be the case that some households who will pay less than that, and some will pay more. But on average, it's over £1,400. Everybody will get hit. My expectation is that they'll raise VAT. David Cameron says, of course I'm not going to raise VAT. But that's exactly what he said in the run-up to the 2010 election, and straight afterwards he raised VAT. As night follows day, they'll raise VAT, £1,400 a year in extra tax, and that will be paid for by pensioners and working people up and down our country.
But by just attributing all of this to working families instead of the whole of society, you make it look like a bigger number than it would otherwise be. Isn't that a bit of a trick you're using?
Well, I mean, it could be that the Conservative Party will instead raise the money by raising corporation tax. I don't think that's going to be very likely. They could try and pay for it by abolishing non-domicile tax status, but they spent the whole of the last week defending the non-domicile tax status when we were getting rid of it. What we've done is we've just said, across the broad base of people in our country, what is the average? And the average is £1,400 a year. Nobody can have any doubt when they read this document and listen to the Tory plans, if they are going to spend £25 billion more without saying where the money's coming from, we know the truth, Carl. It's going to come from you. It's going to come from me. It's going to come from all of us. Everybody in this room will all pay more because the Tory sums don't add up. Yep. Can you say who you are as well, just so it helps?
Matthew Holhus from the Daily Telegraph.
Hi, Matthew.
Two questions, please. On your costings of your policies, I remember at the budget, George Osborne appeared to put holes in 2 of them by saying that he would match the £600 million that you wanted for tuition fees by altering the lifetime allowance on pensions, and the £800 million that you wanted from the city levy for childcare, which he said he'd also raise. You said then that you would, by the manifesto, work out where you'd be able to raise that money from. So can you set out where you can find that extra money from for your policies? And secondly...
that was all
question.
one?
That was all one.
OK.
Secondly, on your announcement on cracking down on tax avoidance at the weekend, you said that you'd like the Bank of England to focus on the risks from the informal economy, including avoidance. Can you sort of spell out in plain English what that means? Are you talking about tradesmen who are paid cash in hand, or is it something else? How does that crackdown work?
On the former question, first of all, our commitment on tuition fees to cut them to £6,000 and childcare for 25 hours were all set out in our manifesto, and our manifesto is fully costed and paid for with no additional borrowing. As I said, 3 years on, nobody's challenged that. On the childcare one, we're going to increase the bank levy by £800 a year, bank levy which we will inherit. So it's £800 million more. In the case of the pension tax relief, there were 3 different elements which funded our cut in tuition fees from £9,000 to £6,000. At the time of the budget, George Osborne said he would spend one of those 3, which was clearly the smallest part. It was less than 20% of the overall funding of our package. What I said at the weekend, when I announced our £7.5 billion a year goal for tax avoidance and tax evasion to be tackled and to bring that money in by the middle of the Parliament, I actually added in some additional changes, discrete avoidance schemes which we were going to change. And one of them was that we're going to rewrite the rules on carried interest, which is often used in the private equity world for people who can pay a lower tax rate, but they do so without actually having skin in the game in the particular investments. And what I said at the weekend was that all of our commitments, which we're paying for by tackling tax avoidance, including abolishing the bedroom tax, all fully covered by the individual avoidance schemes we said we're going to close. And over and above that, we're also setting a more ambitious objective to get to £7.5 billion a year. I'm not going to spend in advance any of the money which is sort of, which is the ambition beyond the individual schemes, because I think that would be to do what George Osborne and David Cameron are doing at the moment, which is to spend money that they've not got. So I'm not going to do that. On the second question, there's some kind of important things which we're going to look at, and we want the Bank of England to look at, in terms of the way in which the informal economy works. One issue which I think is important to look at is that in Sweden, they've abolished high denomination banknotes. There's a debate about that in the United States and in our country as well. The Bank of England has a number of different levers and ways in which they can keep an eye on the way in which this informal economy works. And in particular, there are issues about making sure that we try harder to tackle the use of notes for fraud. And that's one of the things which we would like them to look at. So it's not about receipts, it's about notes. Yep.
Hello, Darren Little from Sky News. Under your plans, by 2019, 12 years after the Northern Rock crisis, we as a nation would still be spending tens of billions of pounds more than we'll be taking in taxes. How do you describe that as being prudent?
Well, we're going to be balancing the books by 2019-20. That's our intention. We want to get all of our current spending more than covered by taxes coming in. We want to get the current budget into surplus. We want to get the national debt falling. I think to have the national debt falling and the current budget back into surplus is absolutely prudent. It's exactly the promise that David Cameron and George Osborne made in 2010. In 2010, George Osborne and David Cameron said by 2015 we will get the current budget back into surplus and we would get the national debt falling. And they failed in this Parliament on both of those objectives. The national debt is rising at the end of this Parliament and they've got a huge deficit still. So they've been unable to meet that challenging objective in this Parliament, and we're going to deliver it in the next Parliament. Yep.
Saki Bhatti, President of the Institute of Asian Businesses.
Hi there.
Shadow Chancellor, I represent businesses from across the West Midlands, not just in my role as President, but also in my day job as Chartered Accountant. What my members and my clients would like to know is what the Labour government will have in store for businesses in relation to, for example, greater rates relief when it comes to business rates, a strategy for the upcoming skill shortage that the businesses are facing going forward, and finally also less red tape, in particular when it comes to things like having a much more SME-friendly HMRC.
Sure. I think it's really important that we are always trying to reduce unnecessary regulation and to make the tax system simpler and easier to deal with for small companies in particular. Just a few weeks ago, Shabana Mahmood, who is the Shadow Exchequer Secretary, published a paper which we've done about ways in which we can improve the way the tax system works for small companies and to remove some of that uncertainty and make things more streamlined. So that's something which we need to continue to work on. More widely, we're going to, as I said, cut and freeze business rates for 1.5 million properties with a rateable value less than £50,000. That will give on average £400 a year to a small company which benefits, and there are very many thousands who will benefit, including very many thousands, I would think, amongst your members across the country. Secondly, we're going to establish a British investment bank, which is going to be there to make sure that it can do better at lending to small companies who want to grow and expand. We're going to change the law on late payment because there's more we can do to stop a late payment culture where large